Hello, everyone. This is Terrance Carroll. I'm back with another episode of Faithful Witness with Terrance Carroll. I took a couple of weeks off because things got a little hectic on the home front between the end of the legislative session here in Colorado, where I was heavily involved, the end of my semester with my doctoral program and trying to finish up my last few papers. And I started teaching again this summer in a master's program in public policy, something that I do every summer. I needed to take a break to make sure that I can bring you the best possible product on Faithful Witness with Terrance Carroll. And I'm glad to be back with you this week. And I think you're really going to enjoy this week's episode. I want to open with a quote from Frank Herbert. He wrote the book Dune in 1965. Frank Herbert wrote, "Once men turned their thinking over to machines in the hope that this would set them free, but that only permitted other men with machines to enslave them." When I read this quote, I could not think of a better thing to talk about than artificial intelligence. And right after I read this quote, the Pope came out last week with his first papal encyclical of his tenure as Pope. And I mean Pope Leo XIV, of course. And this encyclical is called Magnifica Humanitas. This week, I'm going to spend some time in dialogue with this encyclical because the main thrust of this encyclical is not only AI, but also how do we deal with each other as human beings in the digital era, in an era that's dominated by technology and who can control technology and who can control the information that we receive through technology. So thank you for joining me on this week's episode of Faithful Witness with Terrance Carroll. And stay tuned. I think you're really going to enjoy this week's conversation. As a starting point, as we talk about this encyclical, we should put it within context in which it's meant to be read. This is really about Catholic social doctrine. And what I want to look at is Catholic social doctrine from the perspective of how the church talks about humanity and our relationship as humans to each other, what the church talks about when it says the civilization of love, and also about how the church views social justice and how that all intersects when the Catholic Church talks about artificial intelligence and the digital era and technology, especially from my perspective as an ordained Baptist preacher, as a lawyer, as a public theologian, as someone who is getting their doctorate, where I'm looking at something called the Black Jeremiad as public theology. So we're going to try to hold all those things in tension today as we talk about the encyclical. And it's probably very important that I also add that not just as a preacher, but as a son of the Black Baptist Church, as someone who was reared in the prophetic tradition of the Black Church, what does this mean to me? And how does it speak to me from someone who's looking from that perspective? In this encyclical, the Pope starts with talking about basic humanity, human dignity, and where that flows from. You've heard me talk on this podcast on several occasions about how we're all created in the image and likeness of God, which comes from Genesis chapter 1, around verse 26, that God made humanity in God's image. And from that generally flows my notion of how human dignity is. The Pope picks up on this same theme in his encyclical at the very beginning, because at the core of Catholic social teaching is the belief that we're all created in the image of God. And because we're all created in the image of God, a basic human dignity that none of us can eradicate or erase from another person. We're endowed with these things. We're endowed inherently with this human dignity and basic human worth that we have to acknowledge in each other. That's what makes us special, is that God chose to endow us with a spark of the divine, as my Quaker friends would say. And so that's something that universally we all share. Even Enlightenment thinkers would say that we're all endowed with these basic rights as humanness that we have to acknowledge in each other, and we have to treat each other as if we've all been endowed with this basic dignity. Understanding that basic Catholic teaching is that we all are endowed with human dignity, which cannot be trampled over or upon. The Pope then writes this: I consider particularly insidious that one suggests that every person must earn or justify his or her own worth to the point of attributing greater value to those who are more efficient or effective. If we listen to any of the dialogue around artificial intelligence, the use of AI, the digital age, there's been a great deal of conversation about it being more efficient, that we'll be able to get more work done. And inherent and underlying that conversation, especially by some of the strongest adherents to AI and its importance in the future of the American workplace, in fact, the global workplace, it says that we can rid ourselves of some jobs that have traditionally been done by human beings and allow those jobs to be done through artificial intelligence and robotics. When the Pope talks about what's insidious about this, is that we're saying that the worth of a human being is purely to be measured by their value as a being that's capable of a particular output, work output, so that you're only judged by your efficiency and your effectiveness as a cog in this global economy, as a tool in the economy. And the Pope is warning us that that's insidious, it's problematic. And as we get later on in this conversation about this encyclical, we'll understand why the Pope says that. Because once you start saying that our value is based on our ability to produce certain things, you then begin to diminish the worth of humanity. We're minimizing human dignity, and we start down the road of erasing what it means to be a human. We're no longer worthy simply because we're created in the image of God. Our worth then becomes tied to some number, to some metrics, to something that the business folks call KPI. We're only worth what our KPI is, our key performance indicator. And the Pope says it's insidious, it's against basic human dignity. One of my favorite quotes that the Pope has in this is when he talks about certain principles of social justice. He says, Jesus teaches us that justice is born from and fulfilled in fraternity, because the way we approach and relate to the least among us becomes, in concrete terms, the measure of our relationship with God and with our brothers and sisters. Justice, however, concerns not only the behavior of individuals, but also the way in which the structures of society are conceived and organized. So it's not just about our individual relationships. It's also about the way we structure our society, both politically, economically, religiously, It's about the structure of society writ large. And to the extent those structures create inequities, that stands against the will of God. It stands against the teachings of Jesus Christ. Because if you go back to the Gospels clearly instruct us that we have to love each other as we love ourselves. And we can't say that we love Jesus. We can't say that we love God if we don't love our fellow human. And this is the exact point that the Pope is making here, that the broader concern of justice is how we relate to each other, how we interact with each other. And to the extent that those structures that we created cause us to be out of alignment, to not create what Dr. King called the beloved community, those structures and systems are inherently immoral if they stand against the command for us to love. In fact, the Pope touched on this a few weeks ago. I would say probably more than touched on this a few weeks ago when he talked about the over obsession that some folks have with sexuality. He affirms that within Catholic teaching that they have a particular view of sexuality, of marriage, of LGBTQ plus individuals, our fellow humans. He affirmed that those teachings, but he also said there's a broader array of issues that we have to be concerned about. And he started first and foremost about justice and understanding what justice is. And he talked about the poor. He talked about the marginalized. He talked about the oppressed. He talked about the fact that we're going to war. And in fact, he comes back to that, and I'm not going to touch on this too much, but he even argues in this encyclical against the normalization of war because he believes that we have started to normalize war and using violence to enforce particular worldviews. And he says all these things are arguably more important than getting caught up in issues of sexuality. And on this, I agree with the Pope. And then I believe that it was Guy Gittani on his podcast about a week or two ago said that the church is probably too caught up in this crotch Christianity thing. I talked about this last week on a YouTube short, so I don't want to delve into this, but I, again, want to talk about the importance of relationship and love. And justice starts from love and the relationships that we have that are based on love. And you'll understand a little bit later how this is the foundation for the Pope's critique. And I'm not sure if I want to say critique of artificial intelligence. It's more of a word of caution and calling us to understand how we interact with AI and the uses of AI, especially how the morals or as I want to term it, the theology of artificial intelligence and how do we use artificial intelligence as a tool, but not make it our master. Now let's focus about another concern that the Pope raises regarding artificial intelligence. It's the consolidation of power in the digital age. How there are so few people who control technology and control artificial intelligence. How there's so few people who can influence the digital age. And in response to this, the Pope writes, when such power is concentrated in the hands of a few, it tends to become opaque and evade public oversight, increasing the risk of distorted forms of development that give rise to new dependencies, exclusions, manipulations, and inequalities. This is why the Pope is raising these concerns. And these are some things that functional democracy can become very problematic because democracy depends on a free flow of information, an unencumbered flow of information, unencumbered access to information. We have to demand that in this digital age that we're in this AI age, that there's a certain degree of transparency, that we resist opaqueness, that we understand both the limits of this technology and the expansiveness of this technology. In this encyclical, the Pope writes about the need to be vigilant in AI, understanding that it's also a valuable tool. He's not saying it's evil, it's inherently immoral, but he says there's some areas where AI can do more harm than good, both individually and in a structural sense, especially when it comes to our creativity and our ability to think for ourselves, critically think for ourselves. He writes, AI can encourage excessive reliance and the search for ready-made answers and weaken personal creativity and judgment. The apparent objectivity of the responses and suggestions these systems provide can lead us to overlook the fact that they reflect the cultural assumptions of those who designed them and trained them with all their strengths and limitations. The artificial imitation of positive human communication, words of advice, empathy, friendship, and even love can be engaging and at times genuinely helpful. However, for less discerning users, it can also be misleading, creating the illusion of a relationship with a real personal subject. With AI, it's garbage in and garbage out. So whatever the biases are of the people who are programming and coding the AI and putting information into the algorithm and where it's gathering its information on the World Wide Web and other sources that feed into AI, those biases are going to show up. Those bigotries are going to show up in the AI. And then this overdependence on AI can ruin our ability to think for ourselves, to be creative, to engage each other in real and genuine and empathetic ways. It can cause our relationships to become sterile and just merely transactions, not true, genuine human encounters. And I would go a little bit further than Pope Leo and say that this is probably the greatest danger of AI is the fracture that it can cause in legitimate and genuine human relationships, and that they become displaced by digitized relationships that tend to tell you only what you want to hear. For me, the most intriguing part of this encyclical is the Pope's discussion of AI in the age of democracy. And here he talks about truth as the common good, truth in democracy, and why it is important for us to ground ourselves in the truth in order for democracy to flourish. And I would add that it's important for us to operate from a common set of facts in order for democracy to be healthy and to flourish. And that common set of facts is created from us being committed to telling the truth and having sources of information that tell the truth. And perhaps one of the biggest flaws of modern mainstream media is that at times it appears that it's more committed to covering the news, especially political news, as a horse race, as a competition, and not helping folks understand the facts and the truth and the issues underlying policy discussions and debate. Politics is often treated as a clash of personalities and not as a marketplace of ideas where some ideas are more valid and some are less valid. We become caught up in this notion of whataboutism and both sidesism. And that's not always healthy and encouraging discussions that are based on policy as opposed to personalities. And in this regard, uh, when the Pope talks about AI, he talks about its ability to manipulate images and content and how that contributes to an unhealthy democracy because it makes it harder for us to get at the truth, to get at the facts, to get to a common set of values and a common set of facts from which we can actually have real discussion about what is the common good. He writes, the ability to manipulate content and images and video exposes people to biased or misleading perspectives. This problem has both cultural and moral dimensions, since the quality of public communication depends directly on social trust and in turn shapes it. At the same time, truthful information does not arise from centralized or automated control. In public discourse, the truth of facts has a rational dimension as it requires verification, cross checking of sources, and responsible argumentation. Moreover, it is deeply relational, built through bonds of trust and shared practices, as well as an honest exchange with others and with the world. Only the shared pursuit of the veracity of facts perceived as a common good can provide a solid foundation for just communication. This is one of the great dangers of communication in the AI world. How can we trust what someone is saying comes with a high degree of veracity if we are constantly questioning if the information that we're being provided has been manipulated, if the images that we're seeing are true? I believe the Pope is onto something in this next paragraph as it relates to what we just said about the manipulation of images and the lack of trust that we're developing in what the truth is. He writes, at the root of these problems lies a technocratic and post-humanist mentality that tends to regard the human person as an object to be manipulated or resource to be optimized, removing all safeguards against the unchecked pursuit of profit. In this pursuit of digitizing and automating and robotizing, and I just made that word up, I think, in the pursuit of efficiency and effectiveness and profit, we lose track of humanity. We lose track of the human element of life. And if we lose track of the human element of life, if we unanchor ourselves from that, if we stop grounding ourselves in humanity, we lose what makes life life. And what makes life life are our relationships with each other and how we dialogue with each other and how we show each other grace and how we show each other mercy and how we show each other empathy. We lose the ability to be human. And once we lose the ability to be human, life has no meaning. And then it makes it easier for us to divide off into our little corners and to separate from each other and engage in the most cruel and awful behavior toward each other because we no longer see each other as humans who are worthy of life in and of itself because we are humans created in the image of God, but we only see each other instead as profit centers, as places where your worth is determined by what you can produce. And from this, the Pope deduces that when we start seeing each other in that regard, we can easily find ourselves moving toward new forms of slavery, as he says, that are fueled by economic chains and digital infrastructures. We end up with digital haves and have-nots, and the have-nots are dependent for their livelihood on the digital haves. And because that imbalance becomes so great, it is ripe with the opportunity for oppressive activities, both economic and socially and spiritually and politically, to occur where the have-nots are taken advantage of, marginalized, trafficked, and enslaved in various different ways. As a Baptist preacher, I can appreciate this next part of the encyclical with the Pope talking about the civilization of love and what can be done. Is one of my great preaching role models, the late great Reverend Dr. Gardner Calvin Taylor, the former pastor of the Concord Baptist Church in New York. He once said that it's incumbent upon the preacher to move as quickly as possible to Calvary's cross. Granted, Calvary's cross is ugly because it's a lynching, because it's a murder, it's an assassination. But also, Calvary's cross leads us to the empty tomb 3 days later, which is the ultimate sign of hope that we have in this world. And the Pope moves not necessarily the Calvary's cross, but he moves to giving us hope. And he says that we have to remain committed to creating a civilization and a culture of love. This culture and civilization of love, the Pope writes, envisions a social order in which justice and charity are intertwined and love becomes the guiding principle of economic, political, and cultural life. He goes on to say, today we must resolutely recover this vision, for the civilization of love is no naive utopia, but a demanding project which consists in translating charity into structures of justice, giving institutional form to fraternity, and regarding others, whether individuals or people, as allies necessary for building the common good. Very similar, again, to the words of Dr. King when he talks about the beloved community and establishing the beloved community. Very similar to some of the work that I'm working on right now and that I hope to share over the next several months on the ethic of love and the demands of the ethic of love for having a democracy that's more just and more moral and more ethical. It's a stern reminder that we have a commitment to each other to create this culture where we regard the concerns of the other as our own. In fact, creating a culture where no one is othered, where no one is marginalized, where no one is seen as less than anyone else. But if you're in pain, I'm in pain. If you hurt, I hurt. If I'm suffering, you're suffering. That's what the civilization of love calls for. And Pope Leo, if I get this wrong, please feel free to reach out and correct me, and you're more than welcome to come on the Faithful Witness with Terrance Carroll podcast to talk about this. And if any of you know the Pope, tell him he has an open invitation to be on this podcast. I want to wrap the podcast up today in the same way that the Pope starts to wrap up his encyclical. He says that we all can do our part to make this world a better world, that the dire predictions of what AI will do don't have to become true. In fact, they only become true, as several other Christian social ethicists have said, if we allow it to become true. And that's why the Pope argues for reasonable safeguards on the use of AI, safeguards to protect humanity, safeguards to protect the common good. He tells us not to give up hope, that we all can do something in our own sphere of responsibility to create a culture and civilization of love, to maintain humanity, to maintain basic human dignity. And I echo those words, that all of us have something that we can do, that hope only goes away if we allow hope to go away. Thank you for taking time to listen to this week's episode of Faithful Witness with Terrance Carroll. If you like this and if you want to help other people find this, please hit like, subscribe to the podcast, leave a comment. This way, other people will get to see this podcast. And remember to tell the truth, seek justice, and love the people. This is Faithful Witness.